President Carter pledged the utmost in cooperation in the transition that will take place.
And I will always be grateful. Can hardly believe it, but it's sinking in now, the enormity of what has taken place. Peaceful election, eventually a peaceful transfer of power.
I accept tonight the responsibility that you have given me to be the leader of this, the greatest country in human history.
I have a lot to be thankful for tonight. I'm thankful for America and thankful that we were able to resolve our electoral differences in a peaceful way. This peaceful transfer of power is one of the hallmarks of a true democracy.
President Carter, President Bush Sr., as well as the current president have all been very gracious and offered to provide any help that they can in this transition process.
We are now all rooting for his success in uniting and leading the country. The peaceful transition of power is one of the hallmarks of our democracy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I recently confirmed that on numerous occasions, the intelligence community incidentally collected information about U.S. citizens involved in the Trump transition. Details about U.S. persons associated with the incoming administration, details with little or no apparent foreign intelligence value, were widely disseminated in intelligence community reporting. Third, I have confirmed that additional names of Trump transition team members were unmasked. And fourth and finally, I want to be clear, none of this surveillance was related to Russia or the investigation of Russian activities or of the Trump team.
The only thing we had wrong is it was worse than we thought. Devin was the first, because he got to see information first. As then chair of the Intelligence Committee, he sensed there was wrongdoing early on.
He was a lone voice for a very long time. We would not be where we are without Devin Nunes.
They started it right after, the 1st of December 2016.
It's becoming clear we have suffered a desecration of our democracy not seen since Watergate.
It was right after the election, and I thought, are they really going to go down this road of this Russia issue?
This is part of a concerted Russian influence operation.
Russian interference. They colluded. They helped. They were in on it.
Vladimir Putin was the person who authorized the interference in our election.
What Russia did was no different than what they do all the time. It was totally expected. Right after the election, a couple weeks, then I realized, like, wow, they're just really starting to foment this, and we really almost thought it was a joke, like those of us on the Republicans on the committee, like, really, you're not going to accept that you lost this election? We're really going to go into this?
My hope is that the president-elect is going to similarly be concerned with making sure that we don't have potential foreign influence in our election process.
And then Obama and Brennan made it real by creating what I call Obama's dossier, which was this intelligence community assessment, which was the fastest any government agency's ever done a report. And of course, they took just a few weeks and they said, oh yeah, the Russians were trying to help Trump. You know, Obama really was gonna stick it to the Russians, and he kicked some people out of the country.
35 Russian diplomats in the U.S. expelled, just 72 hours to leave. Closing 2 Russian government compounds, rec centers allegedly used for spying, shut down as of noon Friday.
We used the Ways and Means Committee to hold what is a pretty unusual public hearing for the Intelligence Committee. James Comey comes in, then he asks me to come back to the back room and tells me that he's going to publicly announce they're looking into the Trump campaign. And I was like, wow, does he have new information? Is there something new?
I have been authorized by the Department of Justice to confirm that the FBI, as part of our counterintelligence mission, is investigating the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election.
It blew up into a spectacle. It gave the appearance that this was a real investigation with real information, even though we had yet to see what that real information was.
I interviewed
a number of extraordinary candidates for this job, all with sterling credentials. But what gave me confidence that this was the right man for the job was in talking to him a sense that this is somebody who knows what's right and what's wrong.
The FBI's reputation for integrity is a gift given to every new employee by those who went before. No case, no source, no fear of embarrassment is worth jeopardizing the gift of integrity.
Comey has a great history of fabricating crimes and trapping innocent citizens in crimes that otherwise would not be committed by leading the victim to believe that a truthful answer to a question would be an admission to a crime, whereas in fact it would not be an admission to a crime. When the subject then lies, he's bagged his quarry. He did that with Martha Stewart.
He later did the same thing to Scooter Libby through his special counsel that he appointed, Patrick Fitzgerald.
Later on, they did the same thing with George Papadopoulos. He did the same thing with Michael Flynn.
Mike is one of 9 children, blue-collar background, decided to enter the military and rose to the rank as 3-star general, a lieutenant general in the Army, a man who put his life on the line for our country on numerous occasions. He was well-versed in the secrets of our country.
Before he became the director of Defense Intelligence, was made responsible for all intelligence collection in Afghanistan as the theater MI guy. What Mike Flynn did was truly stunning. He revolutionized the way we do intelligence in theater, in the battlefield. He understood that when you're fighting groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, it is the rapidity and the quality of immediately exploitable intelligence that matters the most. When you go in there on your raid with your alpha team, or the stuff you pick up right there has got to be exploited now. You don't put it in a bag, you don't put it on a secure service, send it back to Langley or to Fort Meade and then sit on it for 9 months and then see if it's useful.
When Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, he flew to Washington, D.C. for a meeting with Barack Obama. And in that meeting, Barack Obama told him unequivocally, don't let anybody tell you who to hire in your administration. You must surround yourself with your own people, except General Mike Flynn. The president flew back to New York that night, and I remember speaking to him very directly. And he said, what job are we giving Mike Flynn? I said, any job you want, sir. And then the offer was extended for Mike to become the National Security Advisor.
The Obama administration was after him for defying them on Iran and on other questions. You know, they fired him from the DIA. And famously, in their Oval Office meeting after the election, Obama said to incoming President-elect Trump, you know, there's basically 2 people in the world that you can't trust. So one is Putin and the other is Mike Flynn. I mean, give me a break.
We talked about reforming the intelligence community because these 17 sprawling agencies, they've gotten a lot of stuff wrong. The weapons of mass destruction being the most obvious example.
Every intelligence agency, every bureaucracy is worried about being reformed. So Flynn had been loud and clear that he did not like the intelligence that he was getting when he was in the field. He did not get what he called actionable intelligence. So he was going to cut some nice cushy jobs at Langley.
He was talking about going after people's budgets, seeing who was wasteful, who was doing the job. We're going to cut these institutions down to size and see how it works. So they were terrified.
And then there are probably reasons why the intel bureaucracies are specifically resistant to change, because they really are unaccountable. If you're unaccountable for a long time, you get used to being unaccountable, and accountability sounds bad. Like, you don't want to have to, if you haven't never answered to anybody, you don't want to have to answer to somebody. Especially when some of the things you've been doing when exposed might make you look bad.
As you know, when this attack happened, the White House initially said it arose out of a spontaneous protest over an anti-Muslim video. That turned out not to be true, and the White House said they relied entirely on CIA talking points.
The non-response to Benghazi was a deliberate decision. It wasn't an oversight, and it was because there was an illegal covert weapons program being run there. The community writ large, the Special Forces community, the counterterrorism community, the intelligence community was aware of what was going on. Several members, even in the leadership of the Republican Party, were aware of what was going on. What you had was this bipartisan corruption, and this bipartisan corruption was something that I think Flynn was well aware of. where the intelligence community was no longer necessarily servicing the country, it was servicing the Obama regime itself.
We haven't put any demands on them. We have used this soft power approach.
Mike Flynn is viewed as the consummate disruptor, and now he was going to be in a position to bring that disruption to the entire national security community. So he's moved up a level, and his ability to impact is now going to be much more widespread. And of course, this absolutely terrifies the Central Intelligence Agency. It terrifies the FBI, because somebody who knows where all of the secrets are is now going to be in a position to really harness that knowledge to disrupt things.
He's the former director of the DIA. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew the corruption. He knew the lies. He knew the perversion of the threat environment.
He knew what was going on, and he objected. He knew about the machinations by the Obama administration and the West generally to support terrorists in Syria in their crazed effort to take out Assad. Of course, a lot of that was being organized out of Libya.
When he spoke up against the Obama administration and said, look, just because you killed Osama bin Laden doesn't mean that you've stopped radical Islamic movements. And General Flynn predicted the rise of Islamic extremism.
I'm done trying to convince our president to actually define this enemy. We know what it is. It's radical Islamic terrorism. They are vicious. They're barbaric. They are on the march.
They didn't like Mike Flynn. Remember, Barack Obama fired Mike Flynn because he was a rabble-rouser.
The reason that Flynn had been fired is because he was speaking the truth about ISIS.
The straw that broke the camel's back was what's now been very well known as this testimony that Flynn did. It was the global threat testimony, where all of the heads of the intelligence agencies, John Brennan, Jim Comey, all of the people that later on would be part of the effort to take Michael Flynn down and ultimately take Trump down. Flynn had been raising the alarm about how the Obama administration was not taking the necessary steps to protect the American people from the growing Islamic threat. And Flynn was told before he went into that testimony, do not say anything about the fact that ISIS is resurgent. He decided, I'm not going to lie. You know, I need to be very, very honest with the American people.
They are increasingly adapting to an environment that is actually benefiting them. And that, to me, is a increasingly growing threat.
After that, Jim Clapper calls Mike Vickers up, and Clapper tells Vickers, you need to fire Flynn. Clapper had received this instruction directly from Susan Rice at the request of Barack Obama. In any event, they tell him, you're going to have to retire early. We need you to leave the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Of all the people who came into the White House, Mike Flynn was the most dangerous to the swamp. He had to be taken out. They knew he knew what the intelligence community was up to, and he knew what Obama had done to undermine our national security for 8 years. He knew why Obama did what he did with Iran. $140 billion released to a regime that every Friday says, destroy America, that you're actually facilitating the rise of the theocratic Iranian regime that's taking our naval personnel hostage.
President Obama negotiated the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. It was fatally flawed on so many different levels. So when you have somebody like a General Flynn serving at the highest levels in the room, making recommendations, weighing in on work product, and telling the other 97% of a story on a weak, flawed approach to a particular conflict, that ends up leading to increased resentment. And I think there are people inside the West Wing, right up to President Obama, who became anti-Michael Flynn for all of the wrong reasons. It's a Chicago-style politics approach that was brought here from Illinois into the White House for 2 terms, and they were trying to kick a few people, burn a few things down before they left office.
The Obama administration earlier today allowed the United Nations to pass a resolution condemning Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank as, quote, a flagrant violation of international law.
It was a shift in U.S. foreign policy that was contradictory to the will of Congress. It was contradictory to the will of the American people. It made absolutely no sense whatsoever. It was really disgusting to watch it play out the way it was. It was an effort to kind of burn down a relationship before checking out.
He expelled 35 diplomats from the United States. It was a silly act, unnecessarily provocative, and it was grandstanding. It was to no purpose.
For those who aren't familiar with it, a federal government provides resources for the last two candidates to establish transition teams to help their prospective presidential nominee take over government should they win.
There's nothing wrong or unusual about an incoming transition team talking to folks in other countries about foreign policy. Obama did it as he should do it. Flynn did what he should do, and he diffused what really was a hot mess.
Flynn's calls were intercepted by the U.S. intelligence community. Secret transcripts show Flynn did discuss the sanctions, a potential violation of federal law prohibiting private citizens from engaging in diplomacy.
From the very beginning, this conversation that General Flynn had with the Russian ambassador was about a UN resolution that was coming up. And if you read the transcript, General Flynn had a perfect phone call. He was advocating for the United States. It's exactly what you'd want someone to say. Let's de-escalate this. Let's not try to make it worse than what it is.
So you would want the incoming national security director to be talking to his counterparts in important. Now he doesn't have to talk to, whoever the NSA equivalent is in certain countries, but the Russians, the Chinese, the Germans, our allies and important players in geopolitical sense, he needs to be talking to them. He's doing his job. And of course, the intelligence agencies are listening to Kislyak conversation. That's kind of what they do.
I believe that if anyone inside of the United States government would be fully aware of U.S. intelligence collection capabilities, tactics, procedures, it would be somebody like a Michael Flynn.
Flynn had been in the intelligence world. Therefore, he knew that every single phone call on an open civilian phone is intercepted. Therefore, nobody could suspect that he was somehow plotting, because he wouldn't use the phone, would you? But he didn't realize how determined they were. They pretended not to know what everybody in the field knows, that when you telephone the Russian ambassador, you're not meeting him in a park at night. You telephone him, you are basically telling the U.S. system, the intelligence people, what you want them to hear, what you say.
Rather than say, okay, there's a new president and let's just hand the files over and do a peaceful transition, they really wanted to mess with the incoming president at a time when he was the most vulnerable, which was right after the election and his team was preparing. And so this culminated with attacks on General Flynn. When General Flynn was doing exactly what Susan Rice and Samantha Power admitted in House testimony that they were doing in their transition. If you read the transcript, Susan Rice admits this is what she did. Of course she had a transition period. Of course they talked to other countries. If you weren't talking to other countries, you weren't doing your job. You were preparing to take over the national security apparatus of the greatest country in the world.
Tensions get unnecessarily high with a nuclear armed superpower. You don't necessarily know where things are going to go. So it's probably for the best to try to keep things on a low boil.
In 2015, Putin had said some complimentary things about then-candidate Donald Trump.
After Vladimir Putin praised Donald Trump as, quote, undoubtedly a bright and talented person.
When people call you brilliant, it's always good, especially when the person heads up Russia.
Candidate Donald Trump responded with saying nice things about him. He has a total, absolute understanding of who Putin is. He knows he's a killer. He knows he's an amoral man. He's somebody we have to deal with. Putin may be somebody you wouldn't want to deal with personally, but when I represent 320 million people, he has a nuclear weapon, I better get to know him. But they saw that, and they could exploit those comments that Trump had made, which really meant nothing. They were less damaging than the comment that President Obama had made just a few years earlier when he told Medvedev, who is sort of Putin's flunky, he said, tell Vladimir, when the election is over, I can go easier on him. Wow. Had Trump ever said that, they'd impeach him right away. The New York Times would have done an editorial the next day and said, impeach president, wants to sell our country.
They had the picture of Donald Trump. And in that picture, they refuse to admit that part of Donald Trump could be geopolitical. Therefore, they have to have sinister explanations, like he's Putin's agent. He was bribed, he was corrupted, he was blackmailed, or whatever. And that is how the FBI people were going to get him.
You look at this White House now, and it's hard to imagine two FBI agents ending up in the same room. How did that happen?
I sent them. Something I probably wouldn't have done or maybe gotten away with in a more organized investigation, a more organized administration, in the George W. Bush administration, for example, or the Obama administration. And in both of those administrations, there was process. And so if the FBI wanted to send agents into the White House itself to interview a senior official, you would work through the White House counsel, and there'd be discussions and approvals, and who would be there. And I thought, it's early enough, let's just send a couple guys over.
James Comey and his band of thugs at the FBI, under his leadership, McCabe, Strzok, Page. Comey bragged of this.
Oh, I pulled that off. I basically played a trick and got away with it. If it had been in a more experienced administration, I wouldn't have gotten away with it. And the audience was, isn't it, how funny to set up an innocent man.
James Comey knew the protocol from the FBI was to call over the White House counsel and request a meeting with the National Security Advisor or any other senior staff. Mike Flynn sat down with those two FBI agents. They were then supposed to write what are called 302s.
A 302 is an FBI report of an interview. They interviewed General Flynn just 2 days into his new term as National Security Advisor for the newly inaugurated president. And they did it in what was a complete ambush.
The day that Mike Flynn had the interview with Pete Strzok and Joe Pientka, several members of the national security staff, including the Intelligence Programs Office, were on Mike Flynn's calendar for a briefing. Ezra was part of that team that was going to be briefing Mike Flynn on that day.
Flynn had brought in a young guy named Ezra Cohen to work for him as he went about trying to reset the intelligence community's focus.
He arrived at Flynn's office, and as he explained it, he's standing there and he's waiting for the meeting to begin. The time is running over, and he turns to Flynn's assistant. He says, "Who's the general in there with?" And the assistant says, "The general, he's in there for a FBI intelligence briefing." This was very confusing to Ezra because, in fact, the intelligence briefing that was supposed to be with the FBI was set up for the following day. Ezra's waiting there, and he starts getting this incredible sinking feeling, knowing that Mike Flynn is meeting by himself with two FBI agents. Ezra immediately gets on the phone and calls John Eisenberg, the White House National Security Council legal advisor. John Eisenberg is furious. John races down to Mike Flynn's office, and as he arrives, Pete Strzok and Joe Pientka are leaving the interview. The following day after the fateful Flynn interview, there was the scheduled intelligence briefing. At the interview was General Flynn, KT McFarland, Keith Kellogg, Ezra Cohen-Watnick, John Eisenberg, and from the FBI were Bill Priestap and Andy McCabe. McCabe, at the end of the meeting, goes to Flynn's desk and he says, "General, do you mind if I have a word with you?" Flynn says, "Sure, absolutely. What's up, Andy?" McCabe pulls out the draft interview notes from the Flynn interview out of his lock bag. And he says to Flynn, waving it around, "I just want to let you know we've decided there's nothing here and we're considering this matter closed." Of course, we know that this was a complete lie, one of McCabe's many lies. After McCabe left, Flynn called back in the group of NSC staffers that had been there, pointed to the seat that McCabe was in, and said, "That is a very bad man, and he's out to get me."
2 or 3 days before he resigned, we got a phone call from the Washington Post. And a reporter had said that he had just interviewed Mike Flynn. And Mike Flynn made statements about his phone call to the Russian ambassador, said that he hadn't discussed sanctions. But the Washington Post reporter says, "But we have a transcript," or they were read a transcript, that says the opposite. So we go into General Flynn's office. He said, "I've gone over and over. I can't remember which phone call I had, what conversation in." But what really struck me was, wait a minute. They're talking about a phone call that would have been classified at the highest level. It was so highly classified, I didn't even know the transcript existed, much less was cleared to read it. And yet somehow the Washington Post had a copy of it.
When the David Ignatius article came out of the Washington Post, Mike Flynn was summoned by Mike Pence. He gave us this indication that something wasn't right, and what he was referring to was the fact that Pence had bought into this assault from David Ignatius.
That story then broke. Let me put it this way, it had an external effect and an internal effect. And the internal effect was a lot of people were upset about it. It was basically the chief of staff and other very, very senior advisors were having these conversations. And they continued through the weekend.
So Flynn is really coming under an enormous amount of pressure from the vice president to explain his call from Kislyak. It seemed very unusual that the vice president would be taking this level of interest in this. We now know that it was because he had come under the influence of his chief of staff, who of course was compromised by Comey's inner circle.
They're constantly making Lieutenant General Flynn radioactive, to the point where I'm sure the vice president and president are saying to themselves, well, how do we get this calmed down? Maybe if we get rid of Flynn, it will calm down.
Like I could tell, people were out to get him fired. But I ran around and I started trying to talk to anybody who would listen. I was like, you can't do this, this is dumb, this doesn't deserve this. And also I was trying to appeal to people's self-interest and saying, if you give the president's enemies a scalp like this so early over something so trivial, you're not feeding the beast. The beast doesn't get fat and happy and go to sleep. It brays for more blood. This will not turn this off. This will make everything worse. I can remember at about 6:30 that night, all of us, myself, KT, General Flynn, and the two executive assistants, all in his office, we were urging him to try to see if he could just go and see him. Go to the residence and see the president. And he wouldn't try. He's like, I'm not going to go, and he has to make his own decision, and I'm going to leave it to him, and I will abide by whatever his decision is. My sense was always that the president was reluctant to do it, really liked, and still likes General Flynn. Got along well in the campaign. They clicked in a way that he didn't click with any of his other small team of foreign policy advisors, and really felt the loss. And you could almost tell he immediately regretted it, and on Monday, like 8 o'clock at night, I think, was when General Flynn resigned.
We begin with a major shakeup inside the Trump White House. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn forced to resign after what the administration is calling an erosion of trust. At issue, Flynn's call with the Russian ambassador on the same day President Obama was imposing new sanctions on Russia because of Russia.
Once Flynn was gone, there was nobody to ride herd over what the operation that they had carried over into the administration was going to do. And so they got basically carte blanche. And from there, they began, they were spying on the president, his family, his associates, spying on the administration. When Flynn left, literally within 2 days of that, Ezra first discovered this enormous number of unmaskings that had been done, over 300 of them.
At the end of January in 2017, Ezra Cohen was asked to review a very, very benign policy on how to unmask U.S. persons' names. Ezra asked one of his subordinates to get an example of how the unmaskings had been kept track of at the White House so that they could write this into the policy. When he came back the next day, Ezra came to his office and he found a phone book-sized stack of documents on his desk. And he was told that this stack of documents was the unmasking log from the Obama White House just for the past 6 months. Ezra, after consulting with his staff, decided that the prudent thing to do would be to notify the NSC legal advisor, John Eisenberg. He came back to Ezra several days later in early February 2017 and asked him to retrieve 10 of the reports that had been unmasked by Susan Rice. As the reports came off the printer and they began to look at them in Ezra's office, it immediately became clear that their worst fears were coming true. That the reports, the intelligence that Susan Rice had unmasked, the names that she had unmasked, were the names of Trump campaign officials. And it dawned on them that effectively Susan Rice, in her capacity as Obama's national security advisor, was using her power and authority to surreptitiously spy on and obtain non-public information about the activities of her political rivals in the Trump transition team.
Ezra's continuing the mission after Flynn's departure that really broke the dam open. After they briefed the president and the front office, there was probably a week or two where they were just trying to get their heads around what they were even looking at. It was so shocking. And they decided that they would engage with Devin and say, hey, do you know anything about this? What is going on here? Devin Nunes being the one person elected to political office who really stepped up to help kind of peel the onion open, if you will.
Good afternoon. I know a lot of you are not from the U.S. Congress, so I haven't had a chance to brief a lot of you in the past, but just in order to keep you all fully updated on what's happening with this investigation, today I briefed the president on the concerns that I had about incidental collection and how it relates to President-elect Trump and his transition team.
I mean, I knew it when I saw those transcripts leaked. I knew that we had a big problem on our hands. In this very room, luckily we had some patriots that came forward from the intelligence community and said, look, they were doing some really bad things with unmaskings, you need to know about this, and essentially showed me how to go find it. I'm not going to get into too much of the unmasking of my sources because they're patriots, and to this day nobody knows who they are, and I'm going to keep it that way. The morons in the press think they know who it is. We're the House Intelligence Committee. We just deal with the 17 intelligence agencies. We had people that were very skilled in those areas, but we had no one that was really skilled at the Department of Justice. We got to have somebody who can bust down the doors at the FBI and DOJ, and we don't have that.
Kash Patel.
Kash Patel is Kashyap Patel, or Kash as he's known in Washington.
Kash, I believe, brought a very different energy to that team. As Jack Langer says, who's the communications director, Jack said, it's a relatively sleepy committee. We barely spoke to the press. They're pretty easygoing, they're mellow, and here's Kash. I mean, he's an ethnic New Yorker from Queens, New York, Indian family who lived in Africa, and he just brought an entirely new energy to that team.
Kash was fundamental to gathering information and pushing this. He's got great instincts. This is a guy who really understands the players. Kash knows the intelligence community like I know the State Department.
When he came in to talk to me and started walking me through some of the problems at DOJ, just kind of big picture problems. And almost on the spot, I said, you want a job?
I told Devin, I said, yeah, I'll take the job. But I was so upset at the lack of internal accountability at the DOJ and the FBI that I said, we have to, whatever we find, we're putting out. And I said, look, if we find something that's bad, we're putting it out. And he goes, deal. I worked closely with Trey Gowdy, who was on the committee at the time, and when I first met him, it was a memorable experience. He goes, because he had just come off Benghazi, and he said, well, welcome to the Hill, Kash. This is where good investigations come to die. So we both started laughing. We honestly thought it would be an investigation that almost no one would talk about.
By the time March comes around, we have no intelligence products whatsoever that tie the Trump campaign to Russia. All we have is this dossier that supposedly they're looking into.
So the Steele dossier, it would become the central document for the investigation.
And I remember reading it, and as I'm driving home, I get on the phone and call my best friend in politics, Mark Meadows, and I'm like, Mark, this stinks. There's something going on.
As soon as I heard about the Steele dossier, I downloaded a copy and looked at it and laughed.
If I saw something like the Steele dossier, immediately I'd put Steele under investigation. I'd say, what the hell are you giving me? This is, National Enquirer. When I heard about it in the newspaper, I said, this is ridiculous that they would premise an intelligence investigation on what is clearly a piece of garbage.
Everybody in this town, in the swamp, had that dossier, pretty much. All the left-wing reporters and many high-level reporters at the highest media outlets were all shopped this dossier. In fact, they started, producing fake news stories based off that dossier.
A big part of that New York Times interview they did with Trump focused on what's called the dossier.
Do you think that the original P-tape dossier will prove to be true? Well, we know what he's talking about. He's talking about Christopher Steele's dossier.
So when we went in to be briefed, it's called the Gang of Eight briefing, around the first part of January of 2017, they came to present this intelligence community assessment, and at the end, they start talking about this information, about this dossier information. Very clearly, I asked, where did this come from? These are pretty serious accusations about anybody, right? P-tapes and prostitution and Moscow hotel rooms. I mean, gosh. And like, why haven't we seen this? Right? Like, why haven't somebody should have had this? You know, that was essentially the first time they lied and misled us.
So the Steele dossier was out for a couple months, and I had read it a little bit, but I didn't focus on it because I didn't realize I was going to come to work and do this investigation. So I was like, all right, whatever. It's just another piece of the Russia banana show. And I looked at it and I was like, there's just no way this thing's accurate. And Devin was like, well, how do we figure that out? And I said, easy. Let's take a couple of quick things that we can readily prove to be accurate just using public sources. You know, did person X travel to Prague on a certain date? Great, let's go get the airline records. This isn't hard. Easy. It's an international trip. He was either there or not. And if he wasn't there, where was he? Because if he was in, say, Montana, we'd go find the people that said he was in Montana, or a credit card statement or a hotel statement. Then for some of the more outrageous and salacious components of it, the name of the hotel that Steele alleged that President Trump had misbehaved, there's no such room in that hotel in Russia, in Moscow. But the author of the document, we had found out, was an FBI source. So I said, okay, if he's an FBI source, I said, Devin, he's getting paid. We had to dig into his background a little bit just to verify for ourselves. Yeah, he's a career intelligence officer. He's worked with the United States and other partners around the country, had spent time in Russia. So looks good on paper, but what I found out at the Department of Justice is just because it looks good on paper doesn't mean that person's legit. And, you know, the biggest example of that is James Comey.
Christopher Steele is allegedly a former spy, is willing to do what his clients want him to do. And his clients included Hillary Clinton, the Democratic National Committee, and yes, the FBI. He met with the FBI during the campaign at least 13 times. The documents show 11 of those times he was paid money. Which agencies weren't involved in helping either write or push out this dossier? Now we know the State Department, for instance, Jonathan Weiner, a key official in the Kerry State Department, who really has nothing to do with Russia, who looks to me to be, actually he confessed to helping create part of what turned out to be the dossier. He's not only talking to Christopher Steele and is a close buddy and friend of his. So, you know, in my view, the dossier really was never Russia disinfo. It was always Clinton disinfo. And we can't underestimate how involved the State Department was in pushing this dossier lie out.
Through our investigative process, we found out that a firm representing Christopher Steele, Fusion GPS, was somehow involved in the matter.
Following the money. If we could follow the money, we would ultimately figure out who was paying Fusion GPS.
I walked him through the investigation. I said, this is why I think this happened. This source said X. We can prove it if we subpoena the bank. And he's like, you want to subpoena a bank? I said, Devin, give me one subpoena, and if I'm wrong, you can fire me. He gave me the subpoena, and we went after the bank. It wasn't like we served the subpoena and everybody went away. Fusion GPS forced us into federal court into litigation over the subpoena itself. And that was when everybody was like, we're on to something.
Fusion GPS is a very, they're very talented at what they do. They're a racketeering outfit. They're essentially, they make things up about people. They spread it to the people in the press. They get them to run the fake news stories. And then even worse, then they find different ways to feed it into the FBI.
And all of these things sort of started coming together in a very unusual fashion. I said, Devin, we're following the money, and I'm going to tell you right now that the DNC and Hillary paid for this. It was 9 a.m. on a weekday, and he literally looks at me, he goes, Cash, if you're going to start drinking this morning, get out of my office. It always goes back to the money, and it's the easiest thing to follow because you have to document it in some fashion or you got to move it in some way. We were able to, pursuant to the judge's authority, allow myself and one other colleague to visit banks' attorneys and review in closed session the records. And we were not allowed to disclose it to anybody what we reviewed. And then finally, on the eve of the ruling of the court, Fusion disclosed that Christopher Steele had been paid by the DNC themselves. There were names that would eventually come out that were being paid by Fusion. Names now that are public, but at the time weren't. Nellie Orr, the wife of Bruce Orr, was being paid by Fusion GPS. We would come to learn to do Russian intelligence information gathering and then submit it to the FBI. We were able to figure out that the attorneys, Perkins Coie, were the attorneys for the DNC. Nellie had been working, Bruce's wife, had been working for Fusion GPS. The folks that Perkins Coie paid $10 million to, and then they took that $10 million and paid Christopher Steele $168,000 to dig up dirt. They paid Nellie Orr, I think, $50,000 to do her research against the president and his daughter, and they fed all of that directly to the Bureau, who then used it in the FISA and in the investigation against the president. So now you've connected the money and the people and put the political party right in the middle of your opponent. It's outrageous.
I've got to give great credit to Devin Nunes because he was willing to go the next step. He was willing to look to where was the funding coming from for the dossier, to go the next step to find out that this was a political document, that it was funded by the Democratic Party itself and Hillary Clinton's campaign. We would not have known that if Devin Nunes hadn't said, all right, look, we're going to do a true assessment of the veracity of the information that we're getting. We're not just going to look at the conclusions. We're going to look at the substance behind those conclusions. Look for biases, look for areas in which it's not accurate, and then pursue those to determine what is the truth.
If what was said in this dossier, the central thesis of the dossier was Carter Page, a Trump campaign associate, is a Russian, basically, asset. And the critical mass in the dossier, in the Steele dossier, was it said Carter Page went to Russia, met with these two guys, Russian oligarchs, and the Steele dossier said at that meeting, Carter Page, a member of the Trump campaign, negotiated an agreement whereby he would get 10 to 15% of Rosneft, which is like the biggest gas firm in Russia, in exchange for his cooperation to work on behalf of the Russians to get better agreements from the Americans when Donald Trump was elected. Now, I told Devin, I said, if that's true, he's a Russian agent, the FISA was righteous, and a lot of people are going to have a lot of problems. But I also said, if that's false, they're screwed. If the Steele dossier were true, the Russians were going to pay this guy $12 billion. Like, okay, open up a bank account. Where's this guy going to move his money? Turns out they had nothing to back up their claims.
Cash had gotten FISAs before, so he knew they had done something really corrupt in order to get that warrant.
We were collecting our documents. We were talking to the FBI. We were talking to DOJ, and they told us. They said, look, you guys are charged with looking into Russian active measures. You should know that this is how we surveilled a certain individual who we thought had ties to the Trump campaign. And we were like, what? And then we went and read it, and having done FISAs myself, I was like, this might be one of the worst documents I've ever seen.
The FISA warrant process has to be followed carefully, and it matters because the warrants are issued ex parte. Here's what I mean. Imagine you're being sued, and you don't know you're being sued, and you can't have a lawyer to defend you in court, and then you found out you just lost a lawsuit. There's not an American who would say that's the most unfair process I've ever heard in my life, and you would say that's the FISA court process. you're being essentially sued in court, and you're not allowed to have a lawyer, and you're not allowed to even know that you're being sued. You're not allowed to look at any of the information being used against you, and you just lost, because now they have a FISA warrant and they can just do whatever they want. That goes against everyone's fundamental sense of fairness as a person. Now, the reason, of course, you don't tell the person you're about to spy on them is because you think they're a terrorist, and if you tell them we're spying on you, obviously they'll change. The compromise or the deal with the devil was supposed to be that in exchange for not giving the person the due process rights that go back to the Magna Carta, that just go back to your holy book of choice, the idea that if you're accused, you're allowed to face your accusers. You have this in every major religious tradition. The deal with the devil, though, is that everything will be meticulously audited, it'll be reviewed, everything will be truthful, everything will be bulletproof. That procedure, of course, wasn't followed.
We now know the dossier was used in the FISA. So we had shredded the credibility of the dossier. And then once we found out it was in the FISA, we couldn't tell anyone yet. Once those two merged, I said, Devin, this is insane that this document was used to go up on a surveillance warrant of an American citizen.
The second part of that FISA is even worse, and that is that they ran spies even before they got a FISA warrant into the Trump campaign. Governments paid United States taxpayers paying for spies to spy on a political campaign, before you even get a FISA warrant. And then not only that, it's exculpatory evidence that they don't even tell the court about.
It was the first time they applied for the application to spy on Americans. The FISA court judge said it sounds like you want to spy on political operatives, and the application was denied.
They knew Christopher Steele was leaking to the State Department and the news media because they had the State Department's documents. That's derogatory information. They didn't tell the court that. They knew that Carter Page was an asset for the CIA, not a stooge for the Russians. They didn't tell the court that. They knew that George Papadopoulos and Carter Page had made statements of innocence, not knowing they were being recorded by the undercover informant Stefan Halper. They don't tell the court that, even though it's in the book, it's in the manual, the FBI manual. This is what you got to do.
So now they've begun this giant web. And if Carter Page or George Papadopoulos had contacted me, Stephen Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, or anybody else within the campaign, it's very likely that all of those people were also being listened to. That unmasking also occurred on literally the day Donald Trump was sworn in as the 45th president of the United States, and they unmasked the Trump children, who clearly they were also listening to.
I knew that I was unmasked, that we were targeted. It was sort of assumed that we were targeted. And I always say, hey, listen, I don't think it would be any stretch of the imagination to say that I, the son of the President of the United States, duly elected, but as a civilian, as a citizen, as someone who worked on a campaign, was the #2 target of the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people.
So I'm Generation X, and some kind of significant meme that surfaced before we called them memes was 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. This is pre-social media. The idea would be, how many connections would it take you to get to a world-famous celebrity? Well, the reason I bring up 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon is because to spy on the Trump campaign, the FBI used the 3-jump rule.
In these FISA warrants, when you surveil one party, you have what is known as a 2-jump rule. You not only get to spy on Carter Page, but you get 2 jumps, or as the Obama administration would have it, 3 jumps from Carter Page, the surveilled person.
You don't even need 3 jumps. 2 jumps get you everywhere you want to be within the campaign, as long as you have like a network node.
Having wiretapped Carter Page, you can now wiretap Steve Bannon. Corey Lewandowski then talks to Trump. You've got a 3rd jump, so now you're wiretapping everyone. So that's what they were trying to do, figuring if they could get into the Trump campaign, somewhere there would be a crime.
January 17, the dossier comes out. March, April, we start our investigation. Summertime, we're cranking on document production and collating a list of witnesses we're going to interview. Fall, hit the home run with the Fusion Clowns and figure out who paid for the dossier. So now we're in September, October, going into the holidays. And we had finally also at this time started interviewing witnesses. And in December, we got Andy McCabe. When we asked Andy McCabe, could you have gotten the FISA application against Carter Page without the Steele dossier? And he said no. And I think we ended up doing 65 interviews. We hit everybody, former attorneys generals, Loretta Lynch, Sally Yates, Andy McCabe, James Comey. The central thesis was the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government to hijack the election. Okay, let's find out. So we came up with the 3C questions we were gonna ask every single witness. Do you have any evidence or information that the Trump campaign colluded, conspired, or coordinated with any member of the Russian government, with any member of the Trump campaign or Trump presidency? And all 65 witnesses under oath said no to every question. We had to ask that because they were saying it in the media that happened, so these principals were the ones who would have to know that. And if they answered yes, we'd have to report that to the public. And they couldn't just answer a simple question of, where's the dirt?
Reviewing the evidence that I have, I don't think you can conclude that at all.
We had not one person claim that they had or had seen evidence of Trump colluding with the Russians. Not a single one of them could cite any evidence whatsoever that they saw. That's what was going on behind closed doors. Then on TV, you go there and you see Schiff come out and talking about how, more treason has been revealed by Trump.
All you have right now is a circumstantial case.
Actually, no, Chuck. I can tell you that the case is more than that, and I can't go into the particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence now.
Then there was also the private world of people that we would have to interview as well. The Podesta and Hillary Clinton's campaign. The CrowdStrike thing was a big deal. Podesta, as the head of the campaign, or whatever his role was, had hired this company to do a scrub of their internal services to be like, who's in our stuff, what happened, how did this go down, which is a reasonable thing to do when you get hacked. What's an unreasonable and made-up thing to do is then falsely tie it to the wrong person or country or actor. Normally what would happen in this type of hack is the FBI would come in and have our experts scrub the servers. The DNC hired CrowdStrike, and CrowdStrike was in full control, and James Comey has publicly admitted this, of what servers the FBI had access to. So the FBI was only given limited access, whatever the DNC chose. So those were the only servers they were ever able to look at. And this is why you have the disconnect that they've been saying continuously, that the DNC was hacked. It was Podesta's email that was hacked. Nobody knows to this day what actually happened because the FBI has never looked at the entirety of the servers from the DNC, and they can turn those over anytime they wanted to. But they won't because they know it won't be good for them.
Stunning announcement from the White House today. President Trump fires FBI Director James Comey. It's only the second time in history that a president has fired the head of the Bureau.
I think the insurance policy morphed over time. I think initially the insurance policy was, we're going to do this investigation, we're going to get after the president, we're going to spy on his campaign. They did all that. Donald Trump and the American people surprised all of them, and President Trump wins. When he wins, the insurance policy becomes, wow, we got to make sure they don't find out what we did. And who better to find that out? Michael Flynn. So they go after Michael Flynn. Once they get him gone, they think they're fine until Jim Comey gets fired, because Jim Comey was traveling into the next administration too. When he gets fired, then the insurance policy morphs again and it becomes, Shazam, we got to do something now. We've lost Comey, we've lost our man. So what does Comey do? Leaks his memos to get a special counsel appointed, and who better than his best pal, Bob Mueller, to run it for 2 years. That's how the insurance policy morphed over time.
Robert Mueller, it was mid-May, I think, wants his old job back. He's out to pasture. Clearly he's losing his cognitive capacity, but he thinks, or his buddies think, that he can come back to direct the FBI like he did before. And why is that important? Because if Mueller, who's good buddies with Comey, with Weissman, with all of these Trump-hating, anti-American, Democrat cabal operatives, if they can get Bob, their buddy, back at the Hoover Building, he can just shred it all. He can make all the evidence disappear. Operation Crossfire Hurricane against Mike Flynn, everything else will just be deep-sixed. So Mueller is escorted to the White House by Rod Rosenstein, his friend. Rod Rosenstein arch, deep state swamp creature is in fact running Donald Trump's Department of Justice, because Jeff's just removed himself. President meets with Robert Mueller out of professional courtesy, realizes within minutes, sorry, you can't even string a coherent sentence. You don't represent making America great again. Your old school establishment, you're past your sell-by date. Thank you very much. No thanks. Less than 24 hours later, the guy who's really running the DOJ, Rod Rosenstein, makes his friend, Robert Mueller, the most powerful man in the world. He makes him special counsel, special prosecutor, who has the power to bring down the president.
Mueller should never have taken the job. He was compromised, he was conflicted, and it was the appointment arose, it flowed from an illegal act by his friend James Comey, the release of those files. And it was part of a coup. And when he came on board, he could have known and should have known that there was nothing to investigate. And he should have shut it down. Instead, he harassed the president for years. And then they have this extraordinary raid on Manafort's home where they go in and start taking pictures of his suits to prove that he was buying expensive suits and outside his regular income. It's completely absurd. They're investigating Russia and they nail Manafort on mortgage fraud and having expensive suits.
They know that there's nothing there. Comey and McCabe know that they have done bad things. And the special counsel's investigation now is a way of trying to cover their tracks. And they've got their buddies in there, and they're trying their best to cover for them. And hopefully they will get one wrong thing so that they can make a splash and all of their crimes will be forgotten.
We were pretty careful because we didn't want to step over any lines, and it ends up the corruption is just far worse than even we could have imagined, and we imagined it was pretty bad. When the Nunes memo came out, we thought the whole thing's over. This blows up. It's the end of Mueller. It's the end of the investigation, and the investigators need to be investigated.
Before it was published, they were all saying that Nunes is reckless. This is extremely damaging to national security. The FBI, the DOJ is going to suffer all kinds of negative consequences. Informants are going to be outed. Everybody's going to die. Nunes is killing everybody is the best way I can sum up the narrative that they had going for him back then. Then once the thing actually came out, it was clear that, look, man, there's no national security threats in people finding out that they used the Steele dossier to get a warrant to spy on Carter Page. So then at that point, the narrative shift to it was a nothing burger. There was nothing in this, all the hoopla over this, okay, so they, they used these unconfirmed allegations to spy on an American citizen. What's the big deal? Carter Page is a weird guy anyway, and, so I'm sure he deserved it. What's the big deal? We had information in there revealing that Comey and McCabe had testified to us that the agents, the FBI agents who interviewed Michael Flynn, did not think he was lying. We had that in our report, and it was redacted. And at the time that our report came out, Comey was going around on a book tour on the country and saying that he didn't know anything about that.
How is it ethical to brief the President of the United States on an unverifiable and salacious dossier? And how is it ethical leadership to not tell him that his political opposition, Hillary Clinton, paid for that?
Shortly after that was when Schiff came out with his counter memo, the Schiff memo, in which he argued that everything in the memo we said was false, that there were no problems whatsoever in the FISA warrant on Carter Page, nothing wrong with the dossier, everything's good, the FBI and DOJ did everything right, Nunes doesn't know what he's talking about, he just made all this stuff up. So they have these two dueling memos, but when the Schiff memo came out, that was championed by the media as the definitive debunking of the Nunes memo. All this stuff that Schiff said is true because Schiff said it.
Devin Nunes was subject to such scorn for saying the conclusions that we brought forth in that report, which all proved to be true. The Mueller investigation had to acknowledge them. Today, the Department of Justice acknowledges them. And they certainly contradict all of the national media narrative that we all had to live with for over a year.
After the IG report came out, I would have thought there would be some kind of, little media frenzy, asking Schiff if he stands by his memo.
Looked into the camera and said they hacked John Podesta's emails. We know for a fact that Putin's government did that. You can't, and you know you can't, and you're hiding behind weasel words.
I just said that the
Say they hacked John Podesta's emails.
Russians, I'm not going to be specific as to
Oh, because you don't know it, that's why. All right.
He would constantly say, I have seen evidence of collusion and conspiracy, the questions we were asking. We did it for a reason. And we would go to him and his staff and said, okay, are you seeing something we're not? Because if you are, we'd like to know. But he knew he could just say it on TV, on certain organizations, and then hide behind, well, it's all classified, I can't get into it. They went straight back to attacking us personally, the media and the left. So there were more attacks on Devin and me. We would always say we're over the target when the ass clowns in the media on the left were just shelling us at the same time. And we knew that was coming the second we hit send, and it came hard.
The story in the Bee came out when?
The cocaine yachts prostitute story? The most absolutely outlandish stories about Devin, and it would be so ridiculous, things that would absolutely defy belief. He was a dumb farmer, he's corrupt, and we were seeing very early on these accusations that he was a Putin stooge, which really stood out to us because the guy, his entire career, he's been a Russia hawk. And there was, for example, a giant billboard on our main highway in the district back home. You had analysts talking on MSNBC speculating whether the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee is actually a Russian asset. Some person filed the California equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act against Devin's wife, who's an elementary school teacher, to get all of her work emails.
They started going after his family, and that's just absurd and totally off limits, and writing crazy things on social media and in articles.
I was not just stalked by the fake and phony press who would hang out right outside this office and follow me everywhere they went.
For Best Supporting Actor in working with the Trump administration and going to meet with them on the investigation.
I also had these big picture fake news stories.
This was going on both at the national level, in the pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the local level back home.
The media had gone wild. They had been writing crazy stories about everybody, including myself, which was unheard of at the time, to write about a staffer, leak his name, call him basically a genocidal dictator.
Cash, they kind of portray it as this sort of Machiavellian genius behind what the hipsy Republicans were doing. A guy nobody should be listening to.
They knew that Cash was the one that was giving us the roadmap.
I remember a specific circumstance where Rod Rosenstein was confronted with the fact that he had signed renewal for this FISA warrant. And he turned to Kash Patel and said to Kash that if this did not stop, if the criticism of Rosenstein persisted, if the efforts to call him to account for that signature were elevated, that it might be Kash himself that would be subject of surveillance of our government.
It used to be politicians launch grenades at each other, and that was considered warfare, and fair enough, all's fair. You beat me, I beat you. We run dirty ads, but now we're getting down to destroying the reputations of individual people.
At its core, this was an information operation, an information warfare operation. It was designed to get out a specific narrative, and that narrative in this case was that Trump is a traitor and he was colluding with the Russians.
The bigger problem is the reporting that the same group of circus animals is conducting is not true. It's not accurate.
In having conversations with reporters as they were continuing to play this story out in the national media, we would explain to them that if you go into a classified briefing and you receive classified information and you step out and you tell reporters that information, you have committed a crime. If you go to that same classified briefing and step out and lie about what happened, you've not committed a crime. So the reporters should be suspect. They should question whether or not this person really is committing a crime or whether or not they're just spinning them and giving them the information that they want to have reported.
I honestly think most at some point would say, you know what, why bother? You know, I just retire from Congress, just go do something else, you know, have a quiet life where, you know, I don't got to deal with this nonsense every single day. But that's just not Devin's nature. His nature is when you're punched, always punch back. And I think that was always his instinct through this whole thing. I mean, he can't be bullied and he can't be intimidated. And at its root, that is what the whole media operation against him was trying to achieve.
Biggest misconception about Devin Nunes is that the memo he released was a hoax, when in fact Adam Schiff's memo was a hoax. They attack Devin Nunes for the Nunes memo based on what Adam Schiff said. And if you're an honest person, you would say, well, how could you just say the Democrat wrote a memo, the Republican wrote a memo, all politicians lie, they're both probably full of shit. I would be okay with that. We know that Adam Schiff claimed that he had evidence of Russian collusion, and he's never called out for any of that. But if you're a Republican making those kind of claims, you would never live them down. The media's role in the Russiagate hoax is complex because what we had suspected was proven, ironically, of all places, in the Mueller report. The Mueller report showed how the information laundering works. Someone within the FBI leaks something to Michael Isikoff or David Korn or someone at the Washington Post. That person at the Washington Post writes an article based on the leak, and then the FBI goes and says, look, we have this story about this thing, which means this thing must be true. And then the FBI takes action on that, and then the information goes back to the Washington Post. That's how the information laundering cycle works. Now, boom, #1 story. CNN's reporting that this dossier exists and it contains scandalous information. Who knows if it's true or not? It's salacious. There's a whole big if true thing. Does Trump pee on prostitutes? Well, I mean, how do you know that he didn't, right? I can't say for certainty that he didn't. Oh, so now people are like, oh, Trump peed on prostitutes. I can't believe this. It was all, of course, a big hoax. But that's how you launder that information, and you get a document that is based on fabrications into the news cycle.
For me, going into House Intelligence Committee, it's supposed to be sort of a closed-door meeting. I'm there voluntarily cooperating, trying to help. I believe I was in there for 9 hours straight. And I got done, it was about 7:30 at night. I walk out the building, I finally get my phone back, open up Twitter, and I'm looking. 11:30. Don Jr. said this. It's supposed to be, behind closed doors, and literally at every bathroom break, someone's leaking to CNN what's going on in the room. Like, why would anyone voluntarily go in there and try to work with them to get answers, knowing that they have no intention of trying to deal in good faith?
We're entering into a new era of information warfare. But the information warfare that most scares me is the very tactics that our Defense Intelligence Agency, our CIA, our NSA have used for years to create misinformation and propaganda, the ability to create false reality on social media and news organizations. They've now been turned inward on the American people. Somebody created a false illusion of sophisticated, extraordinary capabilities. The idea that you're going to take a document that says Carter Page is a CIA asset helping the American public and change it to say, no, he's a Russian stooge, and fake a court with that, fake the Congress with that. That's how far the FBI went. That is information warfare. That's misinformation at the highest levels. And I don't think the American public has come to grips with what the potential threshold we've just crossed.
It's illegal to possess these stolen documents. It's different for the media. So everything you learn about this, you're learning from us.
When CNN says on air, you, the public, are not allowed to look at these, that's what we're here to do. At some point, you've got to say, wow, you got some big balls to stand up on national television and tell the entire world, don't read this, I'll read it to you. I have personal friends who are reporters or who are in like neoconservative or neoliberal fields who genuinely still believe this stuff. They still believe it because their jobs, their livelihoods, their histories, their backgrounds, their resumes depend on them believing it. A lot of this will come down to the supposed fact checkers and editors in newsrooms whose names none of us know off the top of our heads. What role did they play in all of this? Isn't their job to send the bad copy back to Chris Saleza and say, we can't really put this up on the CNN website? Well, why not? Well, firstly, it's not news. It's your opinion. And secondly, it's a mental opinion. it doesn't bear anything close to reality. What are you doing? Please don't send me anything like this again. You know?
Police your own industry. There should be real journalists that stand up and say, this is a phony reporter, this is an advocate, don't listen to this person.
All those who perpetrated this false story have sat in a bunker and refused to acknowledge their wrongdoing, refused to do what they ethically, morally should have done, which is say, we got it wrong and we're sorry and we'll be better at it next time. And instead, we just moved on to another false scandal and created Ukraine, and we'll probably create another false scandal after that.
Half the time when CNN has, bombshell news, it was about me, and it was a lie. These same people, right, that told Congress, no, we didn't see anything, they literally testified under oath the exact opposite, but there's no consequence. We will go on TV day in and day out and lie to the American people to their face, and nothing's going to happen to us.
Want to fire Robert Mueller?
Fake news, folks. Fake news.
What's your message today?
Typical New York Times fake stories.
Mr. Trump.
Go back to 2016. Trump is Hitler. Trump is Hitler. Trump is Hitler. Trump is evil. Trump represents fascism. Trump represents the rise of the new Reich or something. This was their narrative. And this wasn't something that was just put out on the internet or shouted by the Michael Moores and the Code Pinks of the world. This was high-level CNN, Washington Post, social justice crusader narratives and language that was used in the highest levels of America's media institutions.
New York's Daily News ran this front page earlier this week, Trump is Hitler.
And so then when Trump wins in a massive upset, suddenly they have a big problem, because how in their walled garden can they explain that a guy that they told all of their people was the second coming of Hitler, how could 62 million Americans vote for Hitler, right? And so they have a big problem there. How do you explain that away? Are 62 million Americans Nazis, right? No, that doesn't make any sense. Like that's a bridge too far. Then they see the Russia collusion narrative sitting right there in front of them and say, why don't we just say that he cheated? So in their movie, Trump cheated with the help of Vladimir Putin, and then that became the reason that America elected the next Adolf Hitler, and that it became useful for so many various interests. Rachel Maddow uses it to gin up her ratings, right? Because she says, we're gonna get him, we're gonna catch him, we're gonna uncover this.
Well, unfortunately, until this is released, I can't comment on the underlying documents, but I can say among the changes that I thought were notable,
instead of some, smoking gun that was always promised, it's classified, you can't see it, right? That was the game they played until Rick Grinnell blew that one up. Maybe these guys just actually believe that collusion is real and they're operating in good faith. In reality, that wasn't the goal. The goal was never to prove collusion. The goal was always indictments, convictions, and then impeachment. And that was the goal from the very start of all of it.
This is exclusive CNN video. This is what happened this morning before sunrise, just before 6 a.m., when Roger Stone, longtime Trump associate and advisor, was taken into custody by the FBI.
On the morning of January 25th, 25 heavily armed FBI agents in full SWAT gear and brandishing assault weapons arrived at my home at 6 o'clock in the morning in 17 armored vehicles. There was an FBI helicopter overhead. I lived on a canal, so there were two amphibious units that pulled up to the dock with frogmen who were also armed. Then they dragged my wife out of the house in her night clothing and bare feet so she could share my humiliation for the CNN cameras. Now, CNN's cameras, we know from the security footage, shows that the CNN camera showed up exactly 14 minutes before the FBI. This would make it the shortest journalistic stakeout in American history. I think, as most people know, I was targeted for a political prosecution because of my longtime support and friendship for the president.
Stone says he has been encouraging Donald Trump to run for president since 1988.
I would say that I would have a hell of a chance of winning. Between his outspokenness, his national name identification, and his issue positions, he could be a formidable candidate.
The indictment against me came up with nothing. They pasted together a very flimsy indictment for lying to Congress, even though the misstatements I made when I went voluntarily to the House Intelligence Committee were immaterial. They hid no underlying crimes. It was a Soviet-style show trial.
As I have always said, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about.
I was in Congress for 30 hours. I was the target because it would generate headlines. I'm sure there's an element of stress on my father that, hey, they're putting your kid through this. I mean, don't forget, it wasn't like they're saying, hey, we want to find out. You had the former vice presidential candidate of the United States for the Democrat Party, Tim Kaine, Schiff, saying that I committed treason. Treason is a crime punishable by death.
Can you imagine carrying that weight and that burden as a president, knowing that they're trying to go after your child and thinking in some way, hey, look, they're going after my son because I'm president? Do you ever think maybe at night you say to yourself, gosh, is this worth it? They're targeting my family and trying to destroy them and going after your children.
President Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., was back on Capitol Hill this week to talk about his much-discussed Trump Tower meeting with a Russian lawyer who promised him damaging political info during the 2016 campaign.
And he's a father with, 5 children. Children having to hear about this from their friends, listen to it, in school, see it in the paper, on television at night. It's such a scary thing to see, and your heart breaks. When they tell you they want to put you in prison for life or treason punishable by death. Can you imagine when you hear this or you see this about, your father?
My biggest regret of the last 4 years was not being more vocal about what they did to General Flynn. I just said, man, there must be something here if this many people that run these institutions, I still had faith as an American in these institutions. And it was the most misguided faith I've ever had in anything in my life.
Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn thought he would walk out of court free after a sentencing hearing yesterday.
A packed courtroom was stunned as Judge Emmett Sullivan said he could not hide his disgust and his disdain for Flynn's crimes.
At first, I thought he was trying to do everything he could to get General Flynn to scream out, "I'm not guilty." He threw out the word treason, and he said you arguably sold out your country while you were in the White House. I mean, it was just a breathtaking, excoriating dialogue. I was stunned, and he even paused after his tirade for an hour while the media runs wild internationally with calls of General Flynn having committed treason. The pressure on a criminal defendant, particularly in a federal case, is beyond anybody's capacity to comprehend unless you've been there. They threatened to indict Michael Flynn, the son, if General Flynn did not immediately enter a guilty plea. Young Michael Flynn had just had a baby. He had a 4-month-old little boy. He had done nothing wrong. He had been forced to sell his house to pay legal fees. They threatened to indict him just around Thanksgiving and to indict Michael too. They just wanted to stop the pain for the whole family. They were just broken in many ways and saw no other way out. He should have never taken Flynn's guilty plea. They knew he was not an agent of Russia. They knew there was no collusion between General Flynn and anybody with Russia. We learned that they inserted into the 302 statements that he never made, things they never asked him about, to create the purported false statements. I've seen the FBI manipulate 302s before. They had done the major changes the night of February 10 after they had shown the purported transcripts of the calls with Kislyak to Vice President Pence. And then they went back that night and made changes. It was done and altered until it was approved by Andrew McCabe. If this can happen to General Michael T. Flynn, imagine what they do to anybody who has a single strike against them.
There's so much happening in this country right now that boggles the imagination, and you're at the very center of it.
If one person needs to apologize to the American people for propelling this false narrative for 30-something years, it would be Adam Schiff.
Adam Schiff is the modern-day Joe McCarthy. He would come out of an intelligence briefing who would say, nothing there, and he'd go, collusion. You just got to be willing to see it. The willingness to see it is exactly what misinformation and propaganda is. If the facts aren't there and you still see it, you're delusional.
Transparency is not political, and information is power. And when individuals like the Gang of Eight are the only ones to have the information, then they go on TV and they get to say, I can't tell you, but you have to trust me. That trust has been broken because they lied to us.
The best way to clean this whole mess up is with some indictments. That's what people felt during Watergate. That's what we all should feel now if we have any sense of keeping our integrity as a country.
You know, I don't know why criminals engage in criminal behavior. I mean, we can all talk about that till we're blue in the face. The fact is they engage in seditious behavior, and they ought to be prosecuted about it. I don't know who should go to jail. I just want a regular, serious investigation. Heck, I just want someone to be questioned, let alone prosecuted.
Why do you think that is?
Because they don't want to do anything. They don't want to do anything. You're asking the Justice Department to investigate it themselves. They're not going to do it.
Does anyone really believe that FBI lawyer changed that document all on his own? Somebody had to give him that instruction. We know somebody gave the instruction to the FBI agent not to close down Mike Flynn's case when the law said you should close it down. Now we have a dual justice system. There's a Department of Justice for everyday Americans who get punished, and there's a Department of Just Us.
The thing that they were investigating the Trump campaign for, colluding with the Russians, is what they themselves were doing. Not just the Democratic Party and their operatives, but also the FBI.
The Inspector General report on the FISA abuse and the Russia investigation was about the most damning IG report in the history of the United States. And it showed everything we had done and said was true. There isn't any information, because if there actually was, we would have heard about it by now. And the reason there isn't any information or evidence to suggest the Trump campaign coordinated or conspired or colluded with the Russian government is because they did not.
These guys have perpetrated the greatest crime against the American people ever seen. It was a coup d'etat. It was the attempt to take over a duly elected president for their own personal gain.
They made an attempt to overthrow the outcome of a presidential election. That was an American coup. You can't do with the coup d'etat that takes place in Africa or Latin America, where you seize the building of the presidency and you say, I'm the president. Some officials in the political police, the secret police, they are the ones who control the security machinery, and they say, my God, we have discovered that the president is a foreign agent, so we have to arrest him to save the country. If the people in charge of guarding the state choose to turn against the state is defenseless.
This is what third world security states do. They spy on their political opponents like this. They try to send them to jail. They try to bankrupt them.
Once you establish this precedent that, the intel agencies oversee the presidency, and if the American people make a mistake by electing the wrong guy, then it's up to them to correct that mistake. And the fact that people think like that in these agencies, I think poses a fundamental threat to democracy.
To me, this really is the crime of the century when you think about it. When you think about all these different institutions working in concert, colluding, all working towards one goal, to take out the President of the United States.
So I tried to say this was going to be bad and warn people, and I thought I had a good grasp of how bad it was going to be, and I didn't. If you had told me in December or January, as the administration was coming in, Flynn won't last a month because of an op that the deep state is going to run against him, I would have said, come on, it's bad, but it's not that bad. And then it happened. So, just to show you how good my judgment is.
I would say that Russiagate has been the most egregious, malevolent abuse of everything that was supposed to have been good about our government.
It divided the country in ways that people can't imagine. It's inspired massive violence. It's given people who are bad faith actors a license to do whatever they want because they literally feel like they're fighting Russian spies and Nazis and foreign bad actors. If you are right-wing and you're a reporter or a politician, you will have your reputation destroyed. That's if you're lucky. If you're lucky, you'll only have your reputation smeared. If you end up like some other people, you're going to get framed for crimes.
I worry that that is the future of American politics. Personal destruction at the candidate level and the party level is one thing. When it starts getting down to everyday lives, how do you get your reputation back after that? The change in tactics now is anyone who dares speak up and meet the enemy risks the possibility that they will have a false reality launched against them to destroy their reputation and to silence them. And I think that can't be what our founding fathers intended when they created this great democracy and this great constitutional republic.
The most powerful organs of the state are not merely corrupt, but that they've been weaponized to go after perceived domestic enemies. And that's very scary and bad. It means we don't live in the United States of America as any of us would like to understand it. I don't live in that country anymore. The realization of that is maybe the saddest thing I've ever gone through in my life.
It's not just that we're not the United States anymore, it's what is your humanity? What kind of a human being are you if you are essentially a slave? If you are run by intelligence services, if you're run by the press, if these are the people who dominate your public sphere, if these are the people who make decisions about how you live, about how your family lives, about how your friends live, these are the things that you have to contest all the time if you wish to stay a free person and a free people.
It's time for people to recognize that they've got to stand up and push back on the media, demand unbiased coverage, out those people who are advocates and not real journalists, and tell your neighbors, tell everybody in your social media circle that we are the greatest country in the world, that we have the greatest system. We may not be perfect, but our system is perfect, and we know how to fix problems if we just follow the rules.
If I were writing about the time frame that we lived in and that we're living in now, I would say it wasn't supposed to happen. They weren't supposed to know.
You know, had Hillary Clinton won, we wouldn't have known the different crimes and abuses committed by rogue law enforcement officials or dirty cops, rogue intelligence officials as well. That's true, except you needed something else. Had it not been for Congressman Nunes, had he not been willing to do this, and had he not had this particular team with Kash Patel, with Jack Langer, we would not have known what had happened.
He stood up to the mob. He didn't go along with the narrative. He thought the narrative that the Trump people had colluded with Russia was wrong, and he stood up and he said so at a time when nobody else was willing to do that.
History has already exonerated Devin Nunes in many ways because he stuck to the facts. All right, it was an unpopular storyline, but he was right.
Without Nunes, we wouldn't know, we might not know anything about it. I mean, they basically have gotten away with it scot-free, which is sad because the system doesn't work, but at least it's been exposed. And without him, it wouldn't have.
Why is moral courage among members of Congress the type of moral courage that Devin Nunes has? Why is that rare? Well, it's rare in Congress because it's rare in the world. It's a rare trait. To go against a mob, Aristotle had called moral courage the chief of all virtues, because if you don't have courage, then you can't be honorable, because sometimes to be honorable and honest, you have to speak out against lies, you have to stand up for the truth.
That's exactly right. Every Republican, senator, and member of Congress should be saying, this is over. We want every damn bit of evidence that every intelligence agency has, or it's maybe time to shut those agencies down.